ba 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 ba. She's a pop punk girl. Ba 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 ba. She's a pop punk girl. Ba 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 ba. She's a pop punk girl. Ba 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 ba. She's a pop punk girl.
我穿。装呀！不要走，不要搞，不要搞。
Welcome everyone to the virtual dialogue with Dr. Stephen Brookfield. I would like to ask at this time that all of you please go ahead and mute yourselves. And there will be a chance to talk with Dr. Brookfield at some point if you have questions, but for now, please go ahead and mute your microphones. Thank you. So as a reminder, this dialogue tonight discusses the following. What does critical thinking and critical theory mean for us today? So thank you so much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the music from the beginning, as this is a band that Dr. Brookfield is part of. And I would like to say that we are recording this, so if you would like to revisit after the discussion, you are more than welcome to, or to share with someone else. And as we continue tonight, I encourage all of you to keep your cameras on in a show of support for Dr. Brookfield and this discussion. And like I said, you'll have a chance to ask questions if you'd like. We will discuss the value of critical theory as we move forward, and also how we can use critical thinking to change society, especially during this uncertain time. So with that said, I'd like to go ahead and pass it along to Zara.
Thank you, Michaela. We'd like to share Dr. Brookfield's website of resources, which can be found at stephenbrookfield.com. And we highly recommend taking his courses, which are structured as 2-day professional development workshops. And the wonderful course TA for this courses is Julia G. So shout out to Julia. And please take a screenshot of the slide for your reference to see this upcoming summer and fall classes that are being offered. This event is co-hosted by the ALL Network, a student-led interest group of the Adult Learning and Leadership Program, and Ed for Growth, which is a Chinese education initiative founded by doctoral student Ru Hao Chen and his friends from Teachers College. The ALL Network planning team members consist of Michaela Perry, Celine Shen, Ru Hao Chen, Anna Cho, Brian An, and Michael Cusack. And our faculty advisor is Dr. Victoria Marsick. I will now hand it to Ru Hao.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. So, Ed for Growth is an initiative I founded together with some of my friends at Teachers College. So we aim at bringing people from both China and the US to share their educational ideas for each other. And we are so happy that we can have the chance to co-host this event with all network. And actually we've attracted more than 200 people who show their interest in this event. So I'm looking forward to the wonderful talk from Professor Stephen Brookfield. Thank you.
So for the purpose of this event, we very much value your feedback and have created a critical incident questionnaire inspired by Dr. Brookfield himself for you to critically reflect upon the learning experience that you had during this event. I will send out the Google form in the chat box really soon so that you can think about those questions throughout the event. And please complete and help submit by the end of this dialogue. So tonight, we have the privilege and honor to invite Dr. Brookfield to talk specifically about how we can use critical theory, critical thinking to better address our current issues of pandemic and systemic racism, which we all found very relevant and important in today, with perspectives and approaches to lead us to make changes in society and move forward into our future situations. And now I will invite Dr. Marsick, Professor and Program Director of Adult Learning and Leadership Program, and Dr. Maubia, Faculty Director of the Columbia Coaching Certification Program, Associate Professor of Practice in Adult Learning and Leadership Program, to introduce Dr. Brookfield.
Professor Marsick, you're on mute.
I always do that, so thank you very much. See, I told you you would have to coach me. It's really a pleasure to have Stephen here with us, and we were thinking about the number of years that we've known each other. It's probably more years than either of us would like to say. It's been a long time, let's put it that way. And when I joined the faculty at Teachers College, Dr. Brookfield was here with Dr. Mesereau, and so we had a great time working with the Aegis program and other kinds of events, and thinking together about, in different ways, about some of the ideas you're going to be hearing today, at the roots of them, and in particular around critical thinking, critical theory, and transformative learning. I've learned a lot from Dr. Brookfield, and I still do. And I'm so grateful that we still have his presence at Teachers College, even though he is now at University of St. Thomas, and that we can benefit from his books and ideas, but also for the many really practice tools that he has collated or put together and also invented for our use in helping adults learn in one way or another. I'd like to just particularly call out the work, the most recent work, because I think it's so important today with all of the social acknowledgement of social injustice in our society, and the peaceful protests that are going on that are, I hope, keeping the pressure up for needed social change and needed change in systemic racism in our society. And also that it's a good spur to learn more from him about the book that he is writing on creating an anti-racist white identity. Because as white people, we are often unaware of our privilege, and we are unsure about how to operate in this world from that point of view. And I think that his advice and help and thinking in helping us to examine that and take our own accountability for our own actions in relationship to these kinds of microaggressions and other things is really an important part of what we need to learn and do well as well. So I really do appreciate having you, Stephen, here. And I'm going to turn this over to Professor Malpia, who is going to also say some things. Go ahead.
Hi, Victoria, and hi, Stephen, and hello, everyone. Thank you, number one, Stephen, for being here. Well, I will tell you how long we've known each other. In fact, I took Stephen Brookfield's critical thinking class my spring of my first year at TC, and that was the spring of 1990. Where does the time go? So it's actually been 30 years, Stephen, today. At the time I was in corporate, and I was mesmerized, frankly, by Stephen's agility to facilitate adult learning. I came in quite skeptical as someone who was, quote, practical, rational, and said, what can I learn from someone who focuses on higher ed and adult ed and from a corporate background? And by the weekend, I was actually, or not the weekend, after the 2 days, I was definitely one of his groupies. So at the time, he was teaching 3 classes, 1 credit each, 2 days. I took all 3 of them and have followed his work throughout. Stephen doesn't, I've never even said this to Stephen himself, but I actually have a toolkit with all kinds of learning methods, and most of them, about 80%, Stephen, has come from your work. So for those of you who haven't had the privilege of taking a class with him, do it now, do it quick. And for those of you who have already done so, you know how great he is. Like Professor Marsick, I would also like to call out his most recent work. And I had the privilege of observing him as part of a panel with some others, and he has the uncanny ability to help us have very difficult conversations and the kinds that are quite transformative. So Stephen, as always, I'm ready to be mesmerized. Welcome.
So thank you, Dr. Marsick and Dr. Maltbia, for that wonderful introduction to Dr. Brookfield. We would now begin our virtual dialogue today with Dr. Brookfield. If you have any questions at any time, please go ahead and post in the chat box, or wait for an opportunity to talk in dialogue with Dr. Brookfield, as there will be a few moments here and there where he would like to invite the audience to chime in. So to start off today, with the current situation in the world that we have, what can we do to think more critically right now, Dr. Brookfield?
Thank you, Michaela, and thank you so much to everybody who's organized this event, and to Professor Marsick and Professor Maltbia for introducing me so generously. I'm extremely honored and complimented. So what I want to talk about is, what is the role of critical thinking and critical theory in addressing the amazing times that we're living through right now? And when we first talked about this, the main event that was at the forefront of everyone's minds was the COVID-19 pandemic. In the days since, I think the main events that have been at everyone's on everyone's mind has been the murder of George Floyd and the just outpouring of righteous anger across the world, not just in the States, not just in Minneapolis, St. Paul, which is where I live. Although I'm old and cynical about how much will actually change, I'm cautiously optimistic that this will really be the start of something that is more lasting and more profound than the usual thoughts and prayers, homilies that we hear from politicians. And you may have read that in my own city, in Minneapolis, St. Paul, certainly in Minneapolis, the city council has said they are going to abolish the police department and develop a new form of policing. So, I think that bold statements and bold proposals are a good start, and then we'll see what will happen. But I have a feeling that the accountability is going to be very strong here, and people are going to not fall by the wayside. So I thought I would like to begin with just saying a few things. I've developed a PowerPoint of some slides just to give you some prompts to think about, but then I'll stop regularly and take some questions if hopefully there will be plenty. So can you put that up on the screen for me, Michaela?
You see that, Dr. Brookfield?
Yes, I do.
Perfect.
So the first slide is why critical theory? So critical theory, some of you may have sort of dabbled in this area. Some may have spent a long time studying it. Some of you may not really be familiar with it. So I thought I should say something about why I feel critical theory is the most useful explanatory framework for what we're seeing around us right now. And the only reason I really became interested in this as a student many years ago was because so many of the concepts that I was reading about seemed to me to give the best explanation for events that were unfolding. So as a body of work, critical theory is founded on three core assumptions. First is that society is organized to make a state of permanent inequity, permanent inequality appear normal as the natural state of affairs, as the way that things are. So that's the starting point for critical theory. You analyze an organization, you analyze a community, an institution, or a society with the orientation that there is going to be a state of permanent inequity that is so familiar to people, it's taken as obvious, natural, and normal. And no one really makes that much of a fuss about it. The second observation is, well, how is this state of affairs maintained? Well, critical theory says it's maintained by the dissemination of dominant ideology, a set of broad ideas that people internalize, that are embedded in the practices we're involved in, the actions we take, and also the thoughts that we have. And if we can get people to accept dominant ideology, dominant ideologies, then you keep social order. You don't need to have the police out on the streets because demonstrations will not break out, because when things happen, people will just assume, well, that's the way things are. There's not much we can do about it. So critical theory says we use dominant ideology to create this permanent passivity on the part of people where they just say, this is how the world is. And then the third assumption of critical theory, one reason why I'm attracted to it, is that critical theory always says the point of theorizing is not just to theorize, it's to change things. So we use theory as a guide, as a prompt to action. And that sort of action-oriented activist orientation of critical theory has always appealed to me. Can we go to the next slide, please? And I'll just say a few things about critical thinking, since I'm addressing both here. Now, my understanding of critical thinking has been strongly influenced by critical theory. Although I think the things that are on the screen are fairly common amongst multiple paradigms of critical theory, of critical thinking, excuse me. So critical thinking to me has two core processes. The first is that we're constantly trying to clarify, to uncover, and then to check out, to research the assumptions that are framing how we think, how we act, the decisions and judgments we take, and so on. So hunting assumptions is a big thing in critical thinking. And from a critical theory viewpoint, one of the things that I've always been interested in is hunting assumptions about the legitimate use of power. So how do we decide that someone has the right to exert authority and power? What constitutes a justifiable use of power? What constitutes an empowering use of power? So assumptions about power are very interesting to me. And then the second process of critical thinking is exploring alternative perspectives. So if you're engaged in critical thinking, you're constantly trying to step out of your own mental framework, view things from multiple viewpoints, and understand that there are multiple realities out in the world. And I'll often quote Jürgen Habermas, who is well known around TC and in adult education. Habermas said, I think in 1990 in Moral Consciousness and Community of Action, he said that the way that you know someone is becoming an adult is when they cease to universalize their own experience. So a marker of moving into adulthood is your understanding that your experience is just that, your experience, and you shouldn't universalize it and assume that your experience is the same as others. And so clearly in a white-dominated world where white supremacy, which I'll say something about in a moment, is a very dominant ideology, it's very difficult for a lot of whites, myself included, to understand that the world is viewed and experienced and lived in a completely 180-degree different manner by people of color who I see and work with and talk to and socialize with every day. And then the third part of critical thinking, kind of like critical theory is that you take informed action. The only reason you examine assumptions, unearth them, try and explore alternative perspectives is so that in your own life, when you do choose to act, you do so in a way that's informed by the best possible understanding of the complexity of the world that you're moving to. And maybe if we go to the next slide, I'll say one more quick definitional thing. So can we go to the, so in the context of racism and white supremacy, here are some things that I think we need to understand. And maybe we'll talk about some of these tonight. I'm happy to get more deeply into this if that's the way you would like to go. We need to understand how white supremacy, and I'll define exactly what I mean by that in a second, how that is learned and transmitted, how it's embedded in the daily practices and habits and protocols of institutions, the way we hold meetings, the way we decide who should be promoted, the way we run performance appraisals, the way we create reward systems, and so on. I'm particularly interested in how good whites, as Shannon Sullivan has written a book called The Good White, how good whites who see themselves as morally on the right side of history, but who are unaware of white supremacy, can be brought to understand it better. I'm interested in how to develop an anti-racist white identity, as Professor Marsick mentioned. That's the book I'm working on right now. And then also how to dismantle white supremacist systems. So can we go to the next slide? And this will be the last one I will just speak briefly about before I see if there are questions. So what is white supremacy? You know, you hear about this term an awful lot. People typically associated with white nationalism, with marches of the Ku Klux Klan, of other white organizations who are intending to intimidate. So people tend to think of white supremacy as the overt expression of racial hostility. But in critical theory, that's not really what we mean by white supremacy. What we mean by white supremacy is a basic idea that gets deeply internalized and deeply sedimented in our own consciousness, in everyone's consciousness, not just whites, everyone's consciousness, and that also gets embedded in institutional functioning. And that basic idea is the one on the screen. White supremacy as an ideology basically says, well, because whites have superior intelligence, and particularly because whites stay calm and can use reason and logic to make good decisions, they don't get emotional, they don't get heated, they just stay objective, they use empirical evidence to do evidence-based decision-making. That's why whites should naturally be in positions of leadership, making decisions for the rest of us. And conjoined with that notion of whiteness is the notion that people of color who are lumped together in one non-white binary category, all people of color are viewed as too unsophisticated, irrational, and emotional to be entrusted with the reins of power. And so you get a lot of praising of people of color for their soul and their physical grace, but essentially they're still deemed to be too driven by animal instinct, too emotional to be given access to the reins of power. So this is an extremely powerful idea that I have learned myself extremely well. And so what I'm particularly interested in is how do we think critically about this, and how do we help people come to an awareness that this is in place when it's probably against their interests to have that awareness, how do we have these extremely difficult conversations amongst white-only groups, but also amongst multiracial groups? And how can we build on what we know about critical thinking and adult learning to move them into that direction? So I have some thoughts I'm happy to share about that, but I'd just like to break and see if on the chat room we have some questions or commentaries. So team, is there anything I need to address, or does anyone want to raise a question right now?
For Dr. Brookfield, we do have a question from Kalima. And so her question, I'm going to read it to you, okay? Donna Hicks's work around conflict resolution and dignity restoration has fundamentally shifted my view of racial trauma in the USA. Why do you think whites are reluctant to discuss the harm they have experienced in their own lives as a result of the race narrative? And in parentheses, she puts the set of dominant ideas accepted in the mass hypnotism of white supremacy.
I think there are several reasons why whites are reluctant to come to this awareness. Number one, being called a racist for most of us. I mean, there's a minority who's proud to be called racist, but for most whites, certainly that I've had conversations with over my years on the planet, we like to think of ourselves as good people who are humanitarian, who are empathic. And so when we're told that we might be colluding in racism in some way, as you'll know from the white fragility work, a common response is to say, no, 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 that's other people, that's not me. I'm always empathetic, I'm on the right side of history, so on and so forth. So it's just hard for us to question our self-concept as good white people. And again, I would commend Shannon Sullivan's book called Good White People as a very helpful resource on that. I think also the word racist has such power to shame right now that whites have a visceral reaction to it. And one of the things that I and colleagues of color that I've worked with we've kind of talked a lot about this. How do you introduce the notion of racism as a permanent systemic reality without confusing individual people of being racist? And because if you say to someone, you're racist or that's racist, there's a very strong chance that you will have lost them. And you may never get them back. You may get them back, but you may never. I've had many people tell me, well, this is clearly an unsafe space for me here. I'm not going to be in this situation any longer. So, you know, I might be in the room, but I'm not going to say anything because anything I say is going to be deemed racist. So I think that one reason when we introduce racism and white supremacy as kind of salient concepts, what happens is that people think they're being accused individually of being racist, which means you're calling their fundamental humanity into question. You're essentially saying you are an evil person. And so I think the one way to go with this is, and this is where critical theory has really helped me, and I shape a lot of my teaching around this, is you have to teach about racism as a systemic reality, so that instead of saying you're racist or that's racist, you shift the conversation to talking about learned racism, about elements of racism that have been internalized and transmitted, that is in the culture out there, the air that you breathe, and that becomes part of your consciousness without you realizing it. And I'm a strong believer, and maybe we'll get more into this later, in the power of modeling. So for myself, before I would broach anything to do with racism or white supremacy, I'll typically do a fair amount of extensive narrative exposition about all the different ways that I've learned white supremacy, the way that I constantly enact racism, the way that I will never get past white supremacy. This will just be a part of who I am for as long as I live. But having said that, there are ways I can become more aware of it and hopefully mitigate its worst aspects. So I'm going on here a lot, I'm sorry, but if I do feel that extensive modeling is very crucial as a way of easing whites into this idea that racism is a learned phenomenon. It doesn't mark you out as an essentially evil person. It just means that, like me, the facilitator, you have breathed in this air of racism, and it will be a substantial and probably unacknowledged part of your identity. So talking about what a whiteness is, what a white identity is a very big thing for me at the start of this kind of work.
Thank you, Dr. Brookfield. We do have a few more questions. I'm not sure if you want to save a few for later or if you want to keep answering questions, so please let me know.
Let's take a couple, and then maybe I'll move into my next little chunk.
Sounds good. Okay, so the next question for you then, where did white supremacy come from, and could it happen again? And a follow-up to that is Chinese supremacy as the Chinese influence grows. It's just asking the question of that, so.
Well, could white supremacy happen again? Well, it is happening here right now. It's been a permanent historical part of the United States culture. And of course, you can probably trace white supremacy back to the building of the United States economy based on slavery. There's been a lot of very interesting work done in the last couple of years on slavery as the chief engine of American capitalism. And in order to have unpaid, cheap labor, you have to have a morality that supports that, because most people, whites in this country, historically have considered themselves to be Christian. How can you be Christian while enslaving people? Well, you embrace an ideology which essentially says, well, these are actually not people, really. They're subhuman. And so I think that's probably the most clear indication of where this came from. But I would say that in any country, there will be probably a form of racial supremacy or religious supremacy, because genocide is happening all around the world at any point in human history. So although in the United States in particular, it's white supremacy, in other countries, there will be other kinds of racial or ethnic supremacy. There will be ethnic cleansing going on, where one body of people, probably because it's economically beneficial to them, will try and portray another group as subhuman, so that the dominant group can keep access to physical materials, to raw materials that are present in any economy, and to the capital that's available in industrial societies. So I think there will always be some kind of attempt by a dominant group. This is the first assumption of critical theory, to create and maintain a system of permanent inequity and to justify that as normal and natural. Let's take maybe one more question, Michaela.
Yes, so we have a question here in the chat. It seems to me that white supremacy separates the minorities. Could you give an answer to this question on how this occurs? Does white supremacy divide?
Part of white supremacy, of course, the way that it functions as a very effective mechanism of social control is through dividing and conquering. So if you can sow seeds of dissension amongst different groups of color, do everything that you can to prevent people combining in common cause, because that's what the status quo fears the most, is a mass social movement. Mass social movements are extremely difficult to hold, and mass social movements will bring paramilitary force out onto the street, as has happened in the last 10 days. So anything that dominant power can do to keep people divided, to keep potentially insurgent groups pitted against each other, is just a very successful ploy for them to use. And of course, when that ploy falls down, and when people do combine, then dominant power's got a real problem on its hand, and then it has to figure out what are we going to do next, and that's where we are right now. And so I expect to see a lot of what Herbert Marcuse, a critical theorist I've learned a lot from, called repressive tolerance, which is institutions appearing to make change and to acknowledge the legitimacy of challenge, but then actually just rearranging the deck chairs and not doing anything substantive. So the fact, just to go back to a specific example again, that the Minneapolis Police Department, that the city council, which has a majority to veto the mayor here, has said that they will be disbanding the department, that is a pretty significant kind of structural change. Now, there's going to be a lot of pushback against that, but I think that's the kind of thing that happens when a real social movement builds up. So I'm going to call on you to exercise your judgment here, Michaela. Is there another burning question you think I need to take, or shall I do a little bit more exposition?
I believe, so there's a lot of questions still related to this same topic, but I believe if we want to go ahead and move on for a little bit and then come back to this topic, if that works.
Okay, sounds good. Okay. So can we go to the next slide then on deconstructing the good white person? Because I want to get into some of the nuts and bolts of the problems that I'm talking about now from the point of view of an adult educator. So I've mentioned this phrase, good white person. I really like that little phrase, but because it certainly describes me. So I have grown up thinking that I'm a good person who works diligently in anti-racist ways, not to treat people unfairly, not to have racist thoughts, not to let my instincts sort of define how I am and how I'll act. But I would say I've probably been markedly unsuccessful in doing that. But this idea of a good white person is based on some assumptions. And so critical thinking looks at assumptions. So the assumptions that we need to really examine are some of the ones on the screen. I think most people who think themselves as good whites believe they have self-knowledge, that they can peer into themselves and say, yes, my soul is clean. My soul is quite literally white. It's free from any stain of evil. I think good white people believe they can monitor their own racism, that you can accurately say, okay, I know how I'm coming across. I know when I'm sounding or acting in a racist way and when I'm not. I think we also assume that we know how our actions are perceived and experienced by other people, that we can assess the effect of things we say and things we do on people, particularly on people of color. We believe that we treat everyone equally and humanely, that we're free of white supremacist conditioning, and that racism is something that other white people do, not us. So when we're looking at, when I'm looking at a group of whites that I'm working with, particularly if I've been asked in to give a workshop in an area that is relatively rural in Minnesota, where there isn't a great deal of representation of racial minorities, my audience is going to be like this. So if we can go to the next slide. So I realize myself that I'm a good white person, in quotation marks, who does all these things. And I will continue to do all these things. Hopefully I will reduce the amount of times that I engage in them. But it's very important for me to understand that this is who I am. My whiteness means that I have been socialized into this way of being. It's an eradicable part of who I am. And one of the hardest things for me to understand is that I can never expect to be viewed as by people of color as anything but suspiciously. My assurances that I'm on the right side will never be believed, or maybe will only be believed after a long time by someone I've worked with closely who trusts me. And I've learned early on never to declare myself an ally. And maybe we'll talk about why I feel that's a bad thing to do. So if we can go to one more slide, and let me just finish this little chunk here. So the most common missteps that I see in some of this work by white facilitators like myself, who are working in predominantly with other whites, some of them are as follows. First of all, blaming people, saying essentially, why can't you see what the hell is going on around you? Why can't you see that this is a racist system you're immersed in? And shaming and blaming them for their lack of a systemic perspective. Then secondly, preventing a concept of white privilege. I've seen this a lot, I've done this a lot myself, as something that is actively enacted by whites, when in fact, I don't really think that's an accurate way of understanding it. White privilege is something that you're unaware of having, because essentially it's not having to worry about your skin color. So you don't have to worry when you interact with the police, when you go for a job interview, when you call someone on the phone for a reference, so on and so forth. The way that you sound, and then in a physical contact, the way that you look, means you don't have to worry about who you are. I've talked about shaming, denigrating and disdaining people for racial unawareness, preaching from a position of superiority. There's some very interesting work done by a colleague of Professor Marsick and Professor Maltbier and mine, Elizabeth Castle, who moved out to San Francisco, had a group, or has a group called the Euro-American Collaborative Challenging Whiteness. They talk a lot about how racially cognizant whites tend to disdain those other whites that they see as, you know, not being that woke. So it's disdaining unwokeness. I've seen that happen a lot. That's a major problem. And then I've seen conversations where white people, particularly in multiracial environments, are expected to confess to their racism, and then they look to the people of color in the group to grant them absolution, almost to lay their hands on them and say, no, you're forgiven, you are one of the good people. It's a very damaging dynamic you've got to watch out for. I've seen people, and I mean me, often withholding their voice in multiracial dialogue. So often I've been in multiracial groups and I've thought, well, my white voice gets enough of the air. I'm not going to say anything. I'm going to bring people of color into voice. It's very kind of condescending notion. And in fact, people of color tell me, the fact that you're silent shows us that you're not committed to this dialogue. What the hell are you thinking? Why are you staying silent? And your silence is actually a form of power over us, because it's left us thinking, well, what do you think? And then as again, expecting to appreciate it and declaring yourself an ally. And the ally thing, I would just say quickly on this, if someone calls you an ally, that's fantastic. But I've been in a lot of groups where whites have said, I want to be your ally, and I am your ally, and you can look to me for help. And I see a lot of the colleagues of color and students of color either physically rolling their eyes or just not making eye contact, because that sort of earnest protestation that I'm a good person is something they come to expect from whites. And I think that until you're ready to lose something as a white person, and at a very minimum, until you're ready to lose your own personal comfort, you're never going to be taken seriously by people of color. So I got some more specific stuff to go into, but maybe take another pause there, and Michaela or whoever else is monitoring the chat room, let's see if there are some comments or reactions about the notion of the good white person that you want to pose to me.
Yeah, so we do have quite a few questions now. And so I'm gonna try to synthesize one that's kind of developing to a huge topic. But before I do that, I have a question that was asked previously that doesn't really relate, but does white supremacy magnify or diminish well-known accomplishments by people of color, like Obama, Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Frederick Douglass, etc.? And then would their work in society, excuse me, I need to slow down, in society be overlooked if white supremacy were not as ingrained in white people?
Actually, white supremacy, like dominant ideology, all dominant ideologies, patriarchy is another great example of this. It's very slippery, and it likes to appear to be celebrating the achievements of minorities. So Black exceptionalism is a very common tool of white supremacists, not obviously of white supremacist KKK marchers, but of those who believe themselves to be free of racism. So we lift up MLK, we lift up Nelson Mandela, we lift up Gandhi. We have these incredibly influential and charismatic folk heroes, and then we have President Obama become president, and we lift this up as examples of how much progress we're making in particular, and how we admire people of color. And we, in professing our admiration of those achievements and those individuals, essentially we believe that gets us off the hook, that it shows people of color that we're a good person. If we quote the I Have a Dream speech, and we're expecting people of color around us to relax and say, oh, good, he's one of the good ones, right? So I think that celebration of minority achievement is a very skillful way of ensuring that white supremacy stays in place, because you convince people, like after the election of President Obama in 2008, there was a lot of this post-racial society talk, right? And of course, look where we are now. There was no post-racial society that happened, you know, in December 2008. And so that's my dealing with that question. Now, what was there another question, Michaela, or can we move on to the synthesized question?
Yes, so the synthesized question is, there's a lot of conversation in the chat right now about education and the role that critical thinking plays, and the good white person, and excuse me one second, also the role of education reform. So what are ways that education can be used to mitigate this white supremacy or this racism that is going on, and how do we open these conversations within the educational space, both K-12 and higher education?
Well, I look at this organizationally, institutionally, and Professors Marzik and Maltbier know a lot more about this than I do. But it seems to me that in any organization, you have to have educational efforts for change happening on multiple levels. So certainly it's great to have staff development activities. It's great to have me, hopefully it's great to have me running a Teaching Race in White Spaces workshop. It's great to have a curriculum that is expanded to include the analysis of race and racism. So all that stuff, I think, offers moments for progress, particularly if some genuine conversation can be fostered in there. And that conversation will be hard and raw and contentious and difficult. And it means that as an educator, you may be marked down as a poor facilitator by those that you're working with. Because if you make a misstep, and I make a misstep pretty much every time I open my mouth in a new situation, you run the risk of being regarded as the enemy trying to shame people. But if you can have honest conversations in those spaces, I think that is crucial. And I'll talk maybe in the next chunk, maybe the last chunk, on how I think those things can happen. But also, you have to have an organizational conversation around this. So at my own university, for example, by the way, I retired a couple of weeks ago. So now my only official position is as an adjunct professor at Teachers College, which of course is where I started when I came over here in 1982. So, but at my old university, I got into a lot of trouble. And one of the reasons I left was, oh, well, you don't want to hear the politics of it. But anyway, I was trying to say, we've had a lot of hate crime incidents. And right now, there's a lot of stuff on the university website about how we're going to honor George Floyd's memory. Well, I kept saying to the president and the provost, you can't just hold workshops. You, the president, you, the provost, and you, the trustees, as a body, have to come out into the public light of day and have a conversation in front of the whole community about what it means for you to be white, what your white racial identity means for the way that you navigate the world, how it frames the decisions you take. And I offered to moderate that. And of course, it didn't happen. There are all kinds of excuses made why this wasn't a good thing to be doing right now. But I think organizationally, unless you have those in positions of public power and authority having a public conversation on this, on these matters, all the classroom work, all the workshops, all the professional development are not really going to have anything like the effect that you want. So I think what will happen is a lot of institutions will change their mission statements, will put out information about all the anti-racist stuff that they're doing. We'll change brochures, we'll have a multiracial rainbow of faces in all their photos. But until those with the most to lose, who are presidents, provosts, senior academic leaders, and particularly the trustees or the board of governors, unless they come out from behind their veil, because it's the board of governors or the trustees who really shape the direction of the university, unless they're willing to do this, I don't think you're going to have very much change. So what do you think, Michaela? Next chunk or take another question?
If you could take another question, there's one that is very relevant still to this and to the good white person. So if you don't mind.
Sure.
So this question, I'll just go ahead and read it for you. Given your great work on critical thinking tools, I wonder if you could talk about tools to address racial behavior instead of confronting a racist identity, because it appears that many whites are concerned about saying and doing racist actions, being this abstract view of a racist, which she stated that many whites would not identify themselves as so, but many may still engage in tacit and explicit racial behavior. Yes. So any tools and actions for adult educators would be great.
I'll just make a couple of brief comments about that, and then maybe I'll move into a final segment, which is dealing with approaches to this kind of work. So my experience with a lot of white groups is that whites who themselves are educators, so they're there in a staff development setting, let's say, they're very concerned that they don't say the wrong thing. But they don't really know what the right thing or the wrong thing is. So I think there's a couple of ways that you can address that as the starting point for this, for focusing on the behaviors that have, I think, racist elements embedded in them, learned racism embedded in them. So one thing you can do is talk as the facilitator about all the kinds of behaviors that you engage in that have elements of learned racism embedded in them. So I like to share a lot of my microaggressions right at the beginning. I like to talk about how questions that I ask out of genuine curiosity, like saying, where are you from is one of the most common, to a person who doesn't look like a white European, that's something that I've done, I can't tell you how many times, and I still do. It's not like I've erased this from my repertoire. It's just so embedded in me, I'll do it. And in the spirit of, dialogue, curiosity, wanting to know, I'll do something like that. So I think you can start off by giving examples from your own experience. And also there is an awful lot of stuff online about this. I like to use video testimony as much as possible from people of color. And of course, the microaggressions work that Professor Daryl Wing Su has done at Teachers College has had an enormous effect. There's a lot of video stuff out there on that kind of behavior. And then another thing I like to do is to do this work with a colleague of color. So I try and do all the teaching race stuff as much as possible with a colleague of color, and preferably with a woman. So we bring in gender as well into the mix. And one of the things I'll ask them is, can you just tell me the most recent microaggressions that you've seen me committing? Can you tell me the elements of racism or patriarchy that you've detected in our relationship? And, because we trust each other, they're very open about telling me this stuff. And people are, quite surprised to see that as an initial dialogue in a workshop on racism. But I think that's absolutely crucial, because I've been I was in one workshop where the team of facilitators said, as the first thing, they said, I want all white people to stand up and each of you to say, I'm a racist. I want to go around the room and each white person say, I am a racist. And there was no real explanation about what they meant by that. It just seemed like a profoundly shaming action. And one of my long time friends who's worked in Washington Heights for years in ESL and literacy, she just stormed out because she was so insulted by that action. So, a lot of workshops do that. The experts come in and they say, we're going to teach you about racism. What they don't do is start off by saying, here's how we enact racism, here's how we manifest it. So I think that's a crucial modeling part that needs to be in the mix at the beginning. So can we just move then on to the next slide, Michaela? And by the way, Michaela, thank you so much. You're doing an amazing job in keeping on top of the questions and distilling them for me. So I feel very cared for, okay, right now. So let's talk about some approaches. So this is more, I've talked about some of this already. Some of this is advice to myself. So as I'm trying to get people to think more critically about race and racial identity and white supremacy and so on, I have to keep telling myself, Stephen, adjust your definition of success. Don't feel that a session has only been a good one where some transformative insights happen to people, because that's really rarely happens. What mostly will happen is that people will leave feeling confused, resistant, angry. There'll be a mixture of different reactions, hopefully still willing to talk. So my definition of success in this work is doing the work, first of all, having the conversation, and then just keeping it going. And then I feel that as you're trying to bring people into thinking critically about race, and you're doing it within the context of an organization, you should always strive to frame what you're doing in terms of the mission statement, the purpose, the strategic plan that the organization itself says, you know, this is what we're about. And most organizations will say, you know, we're about good humanitarian things, right? So it's easy, I think, to use the mission statement to your advantage. I've talked about the importance of autobiographical disclosure and interracial conversation. I think you need to set your terms out early. So showing that white supremacy is an idea that we internalize, that racism is something that is learned, not an essential part of who you are. We got to understand it as structural, systemic, a virus, and so on. If we go to the next slide. So some of the specific things, I really like the idea of brave space. So there's a lot of emphasis on safe spaces in which people can talk safely without being criticized and condemned. I think sometimes the idea of safety is sort of compressed or convoluted with the idea of not being discomforted. And one of the things that's obviously going to happen is we're going to become very uncomfortable in these conversations. So there's a whole technology called brave space technology. Some of you are probably well aware of and have used yourself, where you set ground rules, where you tell people, here's what you can expect. And I often like to show brief video vignettes from former workshop participants, you know, just maybe 90 seconds from 2 or 3 people, where they talk about how difficult this is and but how necessary it is to, you know, experience that discomfort. And so you have ground rules in brave space, like you challenge behavior, but not the person. So you can say, well, that comment has racist elements embedded in it, but you don't say you're a racist. So you're challenging the behavior and not the person. I have periods where I say, we're only, for the next 5 minutes, we only ask questions of each other. That's all we do. Ask questions and listen to each other's response. There's a whole protocol called Bohemian dialogue I mentioned further down that does that takes up to 2 hours to do. And you warn people that this is going to be emotional, that you can expect anger. So when anger happens, and this is really hard for me as a white person who's learned the epistemology of rational and who was trained in his family never to get angry. We never got angry with each other. We just got silent with each other. So I have had to learn as a facilitator that I've got to be very comfortable with anger being expressed and to fight my instinct to say, all right, let's calm down, let's take a break. But instead, to say, let's just sit with this. Let's just sit with this, think about how it's affecting us, thinking how our gut is responding, what is churning inside of us. And then when we're ready to talk, let's talk. And I think all of that is building some community responsibility. Getting a group to be involved in setting ground rules is obviously the best, if you can do that. So the Courageous Conversations model does this, the Stand Up for Racial Justice, the Surge, which is very strong, church-based movement does a lot of that. Using specific protocols is helpful. I've mentioned a few here. Bohemian dialogue is a kind of 2-hour process where you mostly ask questions and there is an enormous amount of silence and you only say something when you really feel moved to speak. It's almost like a Quaker circle in a way. Methodological belief is, I got this from Peter Elbow, it's where for only 5 minutes or so, everybody acts as if an extremely contentious statement that they don't want to believe, you act as if that were true. And so with groups who say we're in a post-racial world, I will say, well, let's for 5 minutes believe that we are in a society with white supremacy and permanent racism that keeps whites in a position of acknowledged dominance and power. If that were true, what would it mean for you? And for 5 minutes, we can only say things based on our believing that that was true. And I tell people, you don't have to believe this, but for 5 minutes, you have to act as if you can believe this. It's a nice way of loosening them up mentally, I find. Circle of voices, a lot, those of you who've been in my workshops know circle of voices, circular response. They're basically very brief exercises where you pose a question and then everybody has the floor uninterruptedly at the outset to give their response to the question, and you create silence before people have to respond. And it's a way of deliberately including multiple perspectives in the mix without having someone dominate it and co-opt the discussion in a particular way. And then I'm a big believer, while all this is going on, of creating back channels, anonymous back channels. I use a little tool called backchannelchat.com. In everything that I do, I used it when I ran meetings, I use it in classes, I use it in professional development workshops. It's anonymous, real time, and it's a feed where people can post criticisms, reactions, questions, comments, anything they want to say under the cloak of anonymity. And that's where you get really honest feedback about how you're doing, about how people are experiencing what's going on. So I feel that's part of the community taking responsibility for the conversation, because I can watch that feed and then I can address whatever is coming up on the feed right then and there in the workshop. And maybe take one more slide. I'm not quite sure what comes next, but could we go to the next one?
Possible that we can go ahead and wrap up within the next 2 minutes for slides, and then we have quite a few questions again in the chat. So if that would work for you. Thank you.
That was my intention. I just want to see if I've got one more slide. Yes, and then finally, you have constantly to explain your process. So you have to remember that people are fearful and in this environment, and so they're looking to you to be someone they can trust. So that means you need to explain how you're running things, what it means for you to apply fairness. What does that look like for you? Why you stay with a particular issue. Sometimes I will stay just in dialogue with one person, even though 50 others have got their hand up. And I have to give a meta comment, like, I'm staying with this right now because I feel this is so germane to what we're talking about. And you have to explain why you're calling on people, what process you're losing. And also, there are times when you have to say, you know, particularly if there are people say, enough with the white bashing, let's move on. You have to say, no, I'm not going to do that, and here's why I can't do that. And then, of course, scaffolding, as we all know as good educators, we have to scaffold what we do. So I tend in a race workshop to start with mini case studies, events and scenarios that are away from people's experiences. I ask them to read those, to try and detect the assumptions that people in those scenarios and those case studies are operating under. And then I start to move them closer and closer to a direct analysis of their own experience. And I also like to scaffold by starting with pretty glaring examples of racism that everyone can agree on. Yes, this is clearly racism in action. And then move them into greater complexity, more nuance, where people may say on the surface, this looks fine. I also am a strong believer in having direct testimony from those who are on the receiving end of white supremacy. And if it's not coming from people in the room, then I will use video testimony. There is so much online available. And then, as I mentioned already, I like to keep a running tab on how it's going and sharing how people are experiencing it with the community so we can make adjustments in the moment. So let's spend the last time dealing with questions then.
That sounds great, Dr. Brookfield. Thank you so much again. So some questions we have. This one's a pretty big one, but I thought it is really relevant. So with the recent violent confrontations between the community and the police, how do you go about discussing the idea of white supremacy / privilege with officers and community members after the confrontation? And then how can we minimize the polarizing effect of these interactions, if at all?
Those are two really good questions. So I've worked with the police, I've worked with Homeland Security, I've worked with the Marine Corps. So I've worked with the War College out in Fort Leavenworth, all military environments in which there is a strong belief in authority and a reverence for the hierarchy, the chain of command. So in a situation like that, what I typically do is I kind of start off at the side. So I say, well, for example, when I was with the War College, so a lot of you, they're mostly officers, you're under sniper fire, you have to make a quick decision in Iraq, in Afghanistan, wherever you've been deployed, how you're going to respond to that sniper fire, right? So how do you go about, you can't do it in the moment, you can't form a circle and say, how should we deal with this? Someone's got to issue orders. But then afterwards, how do you debrief? And you know, there's a lot of things that go on in police departments, in the military, where people debrief crisis situations afterwards. So I'll ask them for them, first of all, for their mechanisms of debriefing. And then once we've explored some of those, I'll bring in, well, let's switch the kind of crisis that we're talking about. Now let's have a look at what someone is regarding as an example of the overuse of force, or an act of clear police brutality, or clear police harassment. So how would you debrief that? And as they're describing how they would debrief it, they will often debrief it. They will often respond in a completely different way to the way that they said they would debrief something that didn't involve racial identity or racism. So then you can start getting into some more contentious stuff by saying, but hang on, it seemed like earlier you were much more willing to look at your own conduct. You were very clear on examining your own motives, on clarifying the assumptions you're operating under. You are interested in getting other people's who are in the situation with you, getting their experience, not just your own experience as the officer, but those who are serving under you, your NCOs, non-commissioned officers, and so on. So why would that not be the case here? And why, extending that, would you not take extremely seriously the allegations and perspectives and experience of those who are lodging these complaints against you? So you can't just go in and say you're a bunch of racist cops who are murdering people and abusing your authority. Well, you could do that, but you probably wouldn't get very far. Maybe you get a little bit further these days, I don't know. You wouldn't in the Minneapolis Police Department or in the Buffalo Police Department, it seems. So you have to be a little bit more skillful in how you bring that in. And then along with that, you have to give examples as best you can from your own experience of how you have been on the receiving end of what you regard as police misconduct, which is very difficult for most whites. I was arrested once, but I was never charged, so I have no police record. So it's not like I have a long history of being beaten up for who I am. And that's why you have to have, in any kind of training like that, a multiracial teaching team, because your colleagues can speak to that, and then the two of you or the three of you can contrast the massive disparity in your experiences and your expectations, and make it very, very clear that this is only down to your racial identity. That's the only thing that's different between you, that has caused you to be treated in fundamentally different ways. And then you wait for the outburst of open hostility and the pushback and the dismissal and the insults, because they will come either very explicitly or they will come non-verbally. There will be a strong attempt to sabotage it. I've had people all raise up their newspapers in front of them as they were sitting in the front row, so that I couldn't see anyone behind the row of newspapers. That's a very specific response to the first question. Now, there was another broader question behind it, Michaela. What else was going on with our question?
Yes, give me one moment. I'm just scrolling to the question. So the second part to that question was...
The second difficult question.
Yes. All right, here it is. How can we minimize the polarizing effect of these interactions, if at all? And if possible, Dr. Brookfield, if we could keep it to maybe 2 minutes.
Really?
I know, it's tough.
No, I don't feel cared for. No, I do, really. I do, you're right. So, okay, well, how do we minimize? Well, number one, you can't. Past a certain point, you cannot minimize the risks of polarizing. You just have to accept that comes with the territory. I think if you show yourself willing to be able to take the hits, so that's why I love backchannelchat.com. I will quote all the shit that I get from people that's on the back channel feed, and I'll say, you know, well, I thank you for being this honest with me about how pissed off you are about what I'm doing. And it's my job as a public leader, as a professional, to be able to hear, you know, 360 feedback, and in this case, particularly 180-degree feedback. So I need to be able to model that I'm willing to take very polarizing feedback and to respond to it with as much gratitude and honesty as I can muster. And I'm boiling with anger inside, but I cannot give myself the luxury of giving into that. I've just got to stay that white, calm self. So I realize I may be ending up voicing a contradiction to my emphasis on emotionality earlier, but that's my way of dealing with it. I have to show I can take it, stay calm, and model an openness to feedback that's extremely inconvenient to me. So I think that's about two minutes.
Yes, that was great, Dr. Brookfield. I hope that answered the question. It looks like, thank you, Jason. So it did answer the question. So we do have, I'm aware that we're not going to get to all of the questions, so I apologize to everyone else here. But we had one question kind of related to something we touched on earlier with education, but this time addressing organizations. So a lot of organizations right now are taking more of a stance where they're saying racism is not allowed. But do you think that might be getting rid of the opportunity for dialogue within the organization?
That's a great question, because when you say racism is not allowed, that I think implies that there are clear public violations that are so clearly racist that if we just stop those, then we solve the problem, which is a complete misunderstanding of what the problem is. The problem is white supremacy, the internalization, the sedimentation of it within institutional behaviors and practices. So I think it's okay to say overt racism is not allowed, fine, but it seems to me an unproductive path to be going down, because you can pat yourself on the back and say, well, we don't have any more racist speech now. We don't have slogans scrawled on dorm doors anymore. We're done with the racism here. And of course you're not, because what you're fighting is a system. And so, yeah, I think that racism is not allowed. I mean, it's superficially seductive and appealing, but I think it's premised on a false notion of what racism is, which is individually acted behavior, individual acts of meanness. George Yancey calls them individual acts of meanness. You know, that's not, I mean, that's a part of racism, I guess, but it's not really the main thing we're dealing with.
All right, thank you for that. So just to let everyone know, we're going to continue until our hard stop right now is 8:25, with a few closing remarks after that. So I'm going to try to ask, there were 2 more questions. I'm going to try to ask them if it's possible for you to answer them, Dr. Brookfield, within that time, but I understand that these questions may require more time. So the first one, is it more common for minorities to speak their mind when issues arise? And if so, how come and why?
I would say no, it's not more common for minorities to speak their minds when issues arise, because they know the risks of doing so. And they know that if they do that, they will immediately be tagged as troublemakers, as speaking their minds, as uppity. So I think part of the toll racism takes is that you are forced as a minority person to stay silent when every fiber of your being is screaming anger to shout out. And you just have to control that, because the costs that will come down on your shoulders are too great. So, and I think that is a role where whites, if you get that, where you can take a lead, where you have the responsibility to speak up. You don't wait for people of color to point to obvious injustice. You're the one who raises white supremacy. You're the one who points out a racist policy or a racist behavior. So if you want, this whole idea of leveraging your privilege, I think it has some merit. It's also a bit complex, but I do feel that is something that whites, where they can actively make a contribution, being the first to raise those issues.
All right, thank you for being so timely. So one last question before we have to wrap it up. Could you speak to how these dynamics play out in other societies where those in power are not white, but where there are still racial societal assumptions of superiority/inferiority?
Yeah, I think it plays itself out in probably almost exactly the same way. So a critical theory analysis looks at the way that dominant ideology becomes internalized, and the way that if it is internalized in the broad mass of people, inequitous systems stay in place with no challenge to them. So, so we're just happening to be talking about the dominant ideology of white supremacy, but you can talk about a dominant ideology of a religious supremacy, which is a very, very common one around the world. It's the exact same process of normalizing inequality. It's just that the set of ideas have to do with religion rather than with race or with social class, or, that there are, or of course in many societies with gender, where the inherent right of males to control and terrorize women is accepted as just the way things are.
All right, everyone, I hope that answers the majority of your questions. I realize that this is not a dialogue that is going to go away anytime soon. And I hope that it doesn't stay here. It continues onwards with your friends, your family members, whoever is willing to have this dialogue with you, because it's really important right now. So thank you again, Dr. Brookfield, for this wonderful evening with you, this dialogue. And also thank you to the ALL Network, as well as Ed for Growth, for hosting this event. So at this time, we're going to go ahead and say goodbye for the evening, but we hope you enjoyed the event.
And may I say a special thank you to you, Michaela, for facilitating this so superbly.
Thank you, Dr. Brookfield. Also, we will have a recording of this to send out to all of you, so thank you.
Good to see you again, Stephen.
Thank you, Terry. Felt like I should be calling you and Victoria in, or anyone else in. It didn't feel very interactive, but because it's basically me. But I really appreciate you, Michaela, synthesizing and keeping things on track so nicely. That was great.
You did an amazing job.
Thank you.
Appreciate it, Stephen. Very important in these, particularly in these times. It's always important, but particularly now, another voice and a way of helping us bring those things to attention is really important. So thanks.
Oh my God, ain't that the truth? This is so, you know, in a way, I'm kind of glad I just retired, because now, you know, all my professional energy can be devoted to this, and I can feel like I'm not just making tasks up for myself, you know, write another book. So this is great. Okay, well, I'm going to go and have some dinner, and you contact me about that situation whenever you want to, Victoria, and to all the ALL group. Thank you for organizing this so professionally. It's great that you exist, and I'm just glad there was such a big turnout for it. That's really nice.
Yeah, it was amazing. So thank you so much again.
Okay, bye everyone.
Bye. All right, I'm going to stop the recording now.